Well, nowadays, 2024, we are in a new world. We've got 1,000 different chemicals coming at us: GMOs, glyphosate, air toxicity, fluoride in the water, the spike protein. Everything has changed, and our livers are being bombarded with all of this. And even people that aren't eating sugar necessarily are getting insulin resistance. And we don't
Mhm.
necessarily need to get into all of that, but that insulin resistance is presenting itself as increased Alzheimer's and dementia, fatty liver disease, PCOS, and
Mhm.
hormonal imbalances. So, can you explain how the ketogenic diet is helpful in combating this insulin resistance and then the cascade of these diseases that follow?
Yeah, you bring up the liver, and I do think we've always thought the liver is really the master regulator of metabolism, right? And I'm a little bit biased because it's like the site of ketogenesis, but it is it does everything. Like when the glucose in your blood comes from the liver, so the liver regulates gluconeogenesis, of course, but also glycogenolysis, and the level of glucose or glycogen in your liver will dictate like your metabolism and all the signaling associated with it. So gut hormones, so many different things. In regards to insulin resistance, um, so ketogenic diets can help with that for sure. It's just one solution. Of course, exercise, any form of caloric restriction, as long as it's not like overly abundant in like fructose, like typically as like sugar sweetened beverages, things like that can contribute to non-alcoholic fatty liver. What was really surprising to us in data that we've presented at conferences and we're preparing for peer-reviewed publication is that we studied people that were non-diabetic, generally healthy people. And when we did a high resolution ultrasound of them, in addition to a low carb diet as an intervention to look at metabolic optimization, we did not expect it, but we found that the large majority of them had the precursor to non-alcoholic fatty liver, hepatic steatosis. So we saw this, and that was kind of a shock to me, which made me think that more people need to be looking at it. And it didn't necessarily show up on their blood work. Some of them had high ALT levels, but not within the range of some people had high liver enzymes here or there for different reasons. Maybe they had an infection or something like that. But generally speaking, you couldn't really predict it from the blood work. But the liver scans, CT is the gold standard, but you don't necessarily want to expose yourself to the radiation. But there are some pretty good high resolution ways to look at that with an ultrasound. So new technologies that can allow for that. So and so the liver is really the master regulator of insulin resistance, and keeping the liver healthy, I think, is probably the most important thing to do. And that's essentially just like, reducing sugar, making sure you don't have surplus amount of calories, diet, exercise, keeping your metabolic machinery, especially your skeletal muscle, active, and just being active in general. But titrating the amount of carbohydrates for you personally. And that's something it's very individualistic. Some athletes can tolerate 500 grams of carbs a day, and some people get signs of insulin resistance or carbohydrate intolerance at just 80 to 100 grams a day, especially if they're like sedentary. So I think the only way to like unambiguously know this is to get blood work, and actually wear a continuous glucose monitor to look at postprandial glucose elevations and it coming down. That's really the only way to do it. And I think it's more important, actually, maybe more important for people who do follow a high carb diet, because I wear a CGM and I do a low carb keto diet and it's perfectly flat. It's very boring. But if you are an athlete and you're trying to optimize your carbohydrate to your activity levels and things like that, you want to use a CGM as a tool to titrate the amount of carbohydrates per meal and then actually titrate it in during exercise too. A lot of what we do is low carb and ketogenic stuff, but I think, and we use CGMs, and it shows a remarkable decrease in just circadian glucose. We published a paper with Dr. Jeff Volek and Dr. Noakes and Dr. Philip Prinz and Dr. Andrew Kutnick with essentially elite level athletes on a high carb diet versus low carb diet. And the high carb diet, they both performed the same, but the high carb diet showed unambiguously an elevation of glucose throughout the day. And at 3 of the subjects, it was only 10 subjects in a crossover design study. 3 of the subjects were essentially pre-diabetic, with a standard carbohydrate-based diet used. And that was important because if those numbers were to be maintained for like a decade, that would have pretty significant metabolic consequences for those individuals. So even people who are metabolically fit and athletic run the risk of, insulin resistance and carbohydrate intolerance. So that's why it's important to measure.
Yeah, I wore a CGM for a couple months and it was very telling. My spikes were high, but they came down very healthily and very quickly. I actually had my daughter ask me this morning, Mom, does working out raise your blood sugar? Yes, it does, because your body's, your liver's letting go of the glucose and burning that for fuel. But so they're becoming aware of their blood sugar and the importance of it. And I believe that if you were to compare someone on a high carb diet today versus someone 30 years ago, same amount of carbs, same macronutrient profile, the person today would have a higher risk of insulin resistance because of where are they getting their carbs from? Processed foods, GMOs, all of these other factors that weren't necessarily around as much 30 years ago. Eating a whole potato or rice is different than eating Rice Krispie treats and Doritos and Gatorade. And, even if you're an athlete, I've got a daughter that's at USC rowing for the team. You go into their amazing athletic facility and the free snacks and the protein snacks are the little peanut butter and cracker things. And then you've got the Gatorade. The stuff is there's no awareness, even at the highest level of nutrition, of what is real food. And we've gotten away from real food, which has compounded the issue. And that's why I think the ketogenic diet became so popular, was people were searching for answers.